On the shores of Brooklyn is a massive, rundown army terminal, and although it's now basically just another example of forgotten American infrastructure, this mysterious building was once the pinnacle of American safety. You see, through the years, one of America's most critical supply lines has been the North Atlantic trade route, and perhaps no city was more important in that supply system than New York. That's right, and throughout the centuries, it has been the most significant harbor and port complex on the eastern seaboard, a sentiment that's apparent throughout New York as you can walk the Manhattan and Brooklyn waterlines and admire layer upon layer of the once busy shipping berths and piers. The best example of this is the old Brooklyn Army Terminal, a massive industrial complex where American military supplies and men would be readied and stored before crossing the Atlantic. So what is this massive complex's history? And perhaps more importantly, what will become of it? Join me to find out, because today we discover the history of the Brooklyn Army Terminal. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Let's start in the heart of the Great War, when America learned many lessons. Having not fought traditionally large-scale wars beyond its continent, the Army's expeditionary capacity was considerably lagged compared to the European armies of France and England. Therefore, stopgap measures had to be made, such as repurposing captured German ships for use by the American government as troop ships. Still, Congress and the War Department recognized that long-term improvements needed to be made. And so it was. Plans were drafted by the Army, and famed architect Cass Gilbert began the design and construction of a lasting Army terminal for the forward deployment of American joint forces. The chosen site was to be Sunset Park, Brooklyn. Gilbert's design would be an absolute mammoth. Between 58th and 63rd Street, the site consumed 95 acres and contains two massive warehouse buildings linked to 3 piers and administrative buildings. Construction was approved on May 6, 1918. It began just 9 days later. By August, 6,000 workers were busying away on the 8-story structure, as well as a fascinating internal rail yard. The work was done by a conglomeration of Italians, Americans, Swedes, Norwegians, African Americans, Greeks, Russians, Poles, Lithuanians, and several other nationality groups. To support all of this, the Army operated a $20,000 weekly payroll to keep the concrete layers, steelworkers, dock builders, dredgers, and other tradesmen working almost around the clock on what would be one of the largest buildings in the city. So many of these men worked from such a centralized set of neighborhoods in Brooklyn that it acquired its own subway service running every morning from 6:15 a.m. to 7 a.m. It was said by workers and the transit officials that even the normally crowded subway cars couldn't possibly hold this workforce. Even on top of this feat, many men would crowd the Turner Concrete Company's application buildings, understanding the eventual fame that the building would achieve. They wanted a piece of the action. Almost every morning, a line of willing applicants stood from 1st Avenue to 58th Street. The project unfolded around the clock, with laborers frequently clocking 10 hours on site with union pay rates and protections. The dredgers and dock builders often did the most treacherous work mandated by the unforgiving Atlantic tides. This all happened while the concrete workers quickly learned to pour hundreds of cubic yards of steel-reinforced concrete in a single day. On top of that, the two workforces in the main buildings would compete to see who could achieve the most progress in a given day, with the winner hoisting a flag over their tower in commemoration of the success. In fact, the pace of construction was so rapid that these sprawling 8-story warehouses seemed to just pop up overnight, complete with sunroofed atriums and a central railway station. Cranes could move cargo while men dispersed for their tasks on staggered balconies for temporary berthing of building materials. Each building was bridged by the 3rd floor, and via these connection points, Navy cargo ships and troop liners could unload. All of this was completed in only 16 months and opened in September of 1919. Fortunately, the Great War had already ended by then, but the federal and New York governments would find plenty of uses for the buildings from then on. Unfortunately, the terminal saw a lack in traffic, making the government question its overall usefulness. For that reason, in 1920, the Army and Brooklyn approved the leasing of berths and storage space to commercial applicants. Then, in 1923, reform laws allowed merchant marines to use any of the 3 piers not serviced by the Army and Navy. Later during Prohibition, the 3rd and 6th floors were used for storing and destroying alcohol. However, this was only temporary as the terminal suffered massive thefts by the flow of workers and Prohibition agents. For that reason, everything had to be moved into locked vaults on the 7th floor. Other projects included temporary barracks for Army veterans and a military prison. Still, for the most part, its service was commercial, as shipping lines and freight handlers leased the piers and storage areas. This pattern continued peacefully until the spark of World War II. Although it had been built in the Great War, the peace resulting from the armistice and the Depression meant that by World War II, the Brooklyn terminal was still the largest military supply base in the country. With its strategic location in New York City, it lived up to that image. Contemporary evidence tells us that over 3 million American servicemen departed through the Army terminal, while it moved an additional 43 million short tons of cargo and war stock. At the edge of the New York coast, the most significant port on the Atlantic, it routed more men and material to the African and European theaters than anywhere else. This was a significant position for war efforts. It was the nexus of ships, soldiers, workers, freight, and later immigrants traveling worldwide. For example, in just one day, on August 1943, the facility shipped out 61,648 soldiers to the European theater, all while the Major General commanded a mixed military-civilian labor force of 52,000 men and women. The former commander said, quote, "It was all only horse sense. Pick the right men." The senior cavalrymen must have been amazed at the sight of his horses being entirely replaced by trains, jeeps, trucks, and motorcycles bound for Africa, Italy, and France. During the last offensive by the Germans in Africa, the commander's teletype wrote, quote, "Rush ammunition, tanks to General Montgomery." And at this simple order, a convoy of 7 ships moored at the terminal piers were prepared. When one of the ships carrying tanks was sunk, an 8th was loaded and ordered to sprint unescorted until it met up with the original convoy. The military also planned for a capture of approximately 200,000 Germans and Italians as prisoners. In order to keep them alive, there was also a logistics scheme in place for the terminal to send over 1 million rations of food to feed them. This is a home front side of war we don't often consider. On top of all the ingenuity and support, the staff at the terminal literally took the subway home when their shift ended. As the war came to a close, the inevitable drawdowns presented themselves. The port would continue to ship off a further 200,000 soldiers through the Cold War, while repatriating hundreds of thousands of America's dead. The facility also assisted in treating and returning the shipwrecked passengers of the Andrea Doria, as well as the Stockholm. There was also an incident where the center processed refugees from the Hungarian Revolution. In its last year of full military operations, it shipped off the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, with the one and only Elvis Presley among them. Despite demands to keep the facility under Army control and operation, the peace dividend of the 60s had Congress banging on President Lyndon Johnson's door to find ways to cut the Army's budget. As a part of a 1964 drawdown, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Fort J, and the Brooklyn Army Terminal would all be closed. But before that could happen, then Mayor Robert Wagner, Senator-elect John F. Kennedy, as well as a few other prominent politicians stepped in, with Kennedy pointing out that sealing the Brooklyn Navy Yard alone would cost the city over 9,000 jobs, and another 4,000 at the Army Terminal. Even so, by the following year, preparations were underway to move the operations to New Jersey. This decision would relieve part of the burdens that would suddenly be placed on everyone, since the former employees and the handlers at the Brooklyn warehouse would have hiring priority in New Jersey, should they apply. However, the Defense Department and the City of New York did make preparations for the eventual closing of the facility. Although they were initially painful, it wasn't permanent. The terminal was being prepared to get sold off to the city and other private hands. While this was being prepared, shipping operations began again from Pier 1 for wholly commercial purposes. While the Navy quietly took over Warehouse B, this limited capacity kept some men in their jobs and the facility partly operable. All throughout 1975, there were concerns about unemployment caused by the reductions. Negotiations reached several companies but were finalized in 1985 as a $33 million project to modernize the building for more typical industrial and commercial use. In a fun twist, given it still technically had the name Brooklyn Army Terminal, advertisements across New York papers for leases and openings gave the building the nickname the Bat. They posted ads that described getting in early as hitting it out of the park. The improvements realized during this renovation included modern electricity for tenants, better plumbing, an increased number of toilets, and an overall increase in space by another 1 million square feet. Tenants began moving in with many businesses at the end of 1987, but there were also other less glamorous uses by the city. In 1988, the prison population of New York City was rapidly straining the system, as the limited number of facilities across the city were nearly at their maximum capacity. As compensation, the prison barge Bibby Venture was anchored at the terminal's Pier 1, with a capacity to hold an additional 386 prisoners, most of whom were on work release programs and those awaiting trial. When this barge was finally moved to its intended destination at Pier 40, life and work at the Army Terminal continued as usual. Other development projects through the last years of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century expanded the space for commercial and industrial use by yet another 350,000 feet of space to retail and industrial areas, while renovating tens of thousands of feet of leased areas. These simple but expansive modernizations have kept the terminal in use by businesses across New York City. Another benefit to this use is that it also minimized the risk of asbestos contamination, as cleaning and removal occur pretty regularly. By the 90s, the disused piers were being put back into use for a park and sail ferry. And the ideas go beyond that. You see, when the Department of Transportation saw that an upcoming construction project on the nearby expressway would choke traffic for much of Brooklyn, especially those heading to Manhattan, the city quickly approved of needed modifications for a ferry terminal while raising further options for other terminals nearby. But that's perhaps a story for another day. Anyhow, over 100 businesses of varying trades lease out space from the terminal, and more than 4,000 people now work there. One group, the New York Embroidery Studio, which recently moved in, functions as both a clothing designer and a manufacturer, but also served as an important provider of personal protection equipment during the COVID-19 pandemic. You see, the group's founder was shipping out 5 truckloads of personal protective equipment a day during the pandemic, and said that in the event of another emergency, their new larger studio could do even more. The Army Terminal has truly evolved beyond its roots since the Great War. Its private and city handlers have used its space to benefit the whole town and keep the facility alive for future businesses and generations to marvel at. And what a marvel it is. Back in 1918, it was the largest concrete structure in the world, and at that size, it is still clear to see. Suppose you were able to take any of the private tours through the terminal, walking into the central sunlit atrium, and if you have a look at this structure, its imposing walls recall the activity that once occurred within it, with moving cranes loading the arriving cargo on balconies, and GIs disembarking their trains and headed to ships off to Europe. 2 of these trains are still standing there today, waiting quietly, with a pristine coat of shiny brown paint. On the outside, between the buildings, you'd see dozens of cargo trucks still loading or unloading goods into the same berths. But perhaps its most impressive quality is that for years, this complex has adapted through war and peace, serving both the people of New York, but also the people of America. And to be fair, it might not look as ornate as the architect's other buildings, such as the Woolworth Building or the Custom House, but it was still given its brutally simple style while somehow managing to achieve its touch of humanity and flair. The Brooklyn Army Terminal has served New York City for a century, and I feel it'll stay that way for years to come. And with that, I thank you all so much for watching. Until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.